So good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this Getting on Board session, which is part of our Trustee Learning Programme. I'm Penny, I'm CEO of Getting on Board, and today we're talking about writing an investment policy statement. We're really lucky because we've got Libby Barrett with us from Rathbones, and Rathbones are also kindly sponsoring the session, and indeed a whole lot of sessions within the Trustee Learning Programme, which means that they're free for trustees to attend. I've got a few bits of housekeeping before I pass over to Libby. So you will have seen that that it's been recorded. So it may also go on to YouTube. We're going to switch off the recording when we get to the Q&As and the discussion bit. So we're just going to record me and Libby speaking. You've been muted as you come in. We'd be grateful if you stay off mute unless you're asking a question. That just helps keep the airways clear. You can enable closed captions. We've enabled them at our end, so you can switch on subtitles at your end. And we'd love to hear from you in the chat, so please feel free to ask questions. We'll probably take them after Libby's presentation, but we may take some as we go if they're relevant as we go. So I'm going to pass over now to Libby from Rathbones.
Great, thank you. So yeah, good afternoon, everyone. So introduce myself, I'm Libby, I'm an investment director at Rathbones. I sit on our specialist charities team and have been there for over 11 years. Rathbones has been around since 1742 and has been helping charities grow their assets for over 100 years. And we're now the 4th largest manager of charity assets in the UK. In terms of what we're going to cover in this session, so the first half will be more of a presentation. I'll start by setting the scene on what a financial investment is, some of the trustees' duties surrounding them. We'll then talk about the sort of things to consider when setting your investment objectives, what to include in your investment policy statement. Finally, I'll touch briefly on sort of selecting an investment manager and that ongoing relationship. For the second half of today's sessions, we'll put you in breakout rooms and ask you to discuss some of the key elements of an investment policy statement. So, what is a financial investment? Which, I think it's important to remind ourselves of this before we think about investment objectives and policies. The first thing to say is that the purpose of a financial investment is to achieve the best financial return within the level of risk considered to be appropriate by the charity. The second thing to say is that trustees can make financial investments in any asset class that is specifically intended to produce a financial return. The Charity Commission's CC14 guidance lists a number of examples. So cash deposits, corporate or government bonds. So that's when you lend money to a company or government. And I'll say we will circulate the slides after the presentation, so don't worry too much about sort of making notes. Shares in a company, also known as equities, so that gives you the opportunity to share in the profits, but also losses of a company. Buildings or land, hedge funds, commodities such as gold, derivatives, which I won't go in this session, and common investment funds or other types of collective investment scheme. And what we mean by that are sort of funds that pool together money from a number of investors, which they then invest in any of the asset classes mentioned above. There are a number of charity-specific investment funds which you might have come across before. You'll no doubt be aware that trustees have certain fiduciary duties that the law imposes of them, and some of those relate specifically to the charity's investments. So trustees should, firstly, know and act within their charity's powers to invest. So we've already seen that, charities can make financial investments, but sometimes charities' governing documents might restrict certain asset classes or types of investment. So it's worth checking that first. Second, you should exercise care and skill when making investment decisions. The point here is that trustees should use their skills and knowledge in a way that is reasonable in the circumstances. You don't have to have specialist investment knowledge. The Charity Commission isn't expecting you to be investment professionals, but you might find it helpful to have a trustee on the board who is. Thirdly, to take advice from someone experienced in investment matters unless there's good reason not to do so. So you might decide not to take external advice if you think you've got sufficient experience within the charity and on your board. But it's worth noting that trustees who offer themselves up as experts in this context are responsible for the quality of advice they offer and might be liable to the charity if it makes a loss as a result of poor or negligent advice. It's for that reason that most charities tend to delegate this to an investment manager. Next, you should consider the suitability of any investment, as well as the need to diversify the many different types of risk that exist. When we talk about investment here, we mean both the asset class, so shares and bonds, as well as the individual investments themselves. Not having all of your company exposure in GlaxoSmithKline, making sure that's sort of split around. And you need to diversify the risk of your investments across a range of asset classes and underlying investments. And obviously, your investment manager will do this for you. When investing, there are a number of risks to consider. Perhaps the two main ones are capital risk and inflation risk. So capital risk, also known as volatility, is the risk that the capital value of an investment could fall. This is more of a risk with charities with a shorter term time horizon. So if you need to withdraw your money in a year or two, then it's best not to take too much capital risk. What we want to avoid is you needing to withdraw that money at a point where investments are, or sort of equity markets are at a low. If you've got a longer time horizon, then you have the ability to ride out the volatility in markets. Actually, for those charities that do have a long-term time horizon, inflation risk is probably more relevant. This is the risk that your investments don't keep pace with inflation over time. So the real spending power of those investments is eroded. Next, you should decide on an appropriate investment policy. That's partly why you're here today. So a good step in that direction. And finally, you should review the investments and the investment manager regularly. So, you should keep an eye on the performance of your portfolio, say every 3, 6, or even 12 months. We generally say it's good practice to meet with your investment manager at least once a year. And you might want to think of sort of reviewing the overall strategy and your investment manager every 5 years or so. That doesn't mean needing to do a full beauty parade, but you might just want to do a light touch review to make sure that your current setup is the most appropriate. There are some high-level issues worth highlighting that relate to trustees' duties. The first is to say that even if trustees have delegated the day-to-day investment management to an investment manager, you remain responsible for deciding on and reviewing your investment policy on a regular basis, deciding to whom and on what terms to delegate the management of your investments, and reviewing the suitability of your investment manager. The Charity Commission CC14 guidance makes it clear that if trustees have taken advice, have considered the relevant issues and reached a reasonable decision, it's unlikely that you'd be criticised. But it's sensible to record those decisions and the rationale for making them so that they're there for evidential purposes. Some charities choose to establish a separate investment committee to which these matters are delegated. But again, if you do this, the remit of that committee should be documented and their meetings should be minuted. So moving on to setting your investment objectives. So the first thing to think about is to consider why you're investing or what role investments can play within your charity. It might be that the investments are your reserves and can be used to support the charity in extreme circumstances. Perhaps you're saving for an upcoming project, or perhaps you're investing to provide the charity with an income to pay salaries, fund grants, or meet any other income shortfall. Before writing your investment policy statement, it's good to be clear about, exactly what you're trying to achieve, because at the end of the day, this portfolio or your investments are there to support your objectives. And these objectives will be different for every charity. It will depend on your aims, operating model, your timescales, and other resources. But you should consider matters such as, what are the charity's resources and how may they change? So, where do you generate your income from? Is it from donations, legacies, operating activities, or investment income? What does the charity spend its money on? Is it grants, operating activities, research costs? And how are these two things, so income and expenditure, likely to change over time? You should try and assess how dependable your sources of income are and how much control you have over your expenditure. For example, if you receive most of your income from investments, then this is likely to be relatively stable when compared to donations and legacies, which can be a little lumpier. Similarly, if your charity is committed to a long-term spending plan, perhaps you're an educational charity that funds, sort of 5-year scholarships, then your spending commitments are quite set in stone compared to a grant-given charity that thinks of sort of one-off grants on an annual basis. You should also bear in mind whether any of your investments are restricted. So if they've been given or granted to you on the basis that they can only be used for a certain purpose. Overall, you should be satisfied that you have sufficient cash to meet any needs as they arise, but also look to maximize returns on that money that you don't immediately require. So for an example, a simple endowment that spends the income arising on its portfolio can invest for the very long term, as it's unlikely to ever use the capital. It's that sort of charity where the greater risk is that of inflation. In contrast, an operating charity that has raised a sum of money for a project, say in sort of 2 or 3 years time, has quite a short-term time horizon and can't really afford to take much investment risk. Volatility is a big issue there. So it's important to think about your time horizon and how that affects the risk that you can take. Which takes us on to time horizon. So, so with the cash or the investments you have available, it's important to think about, what you need to have in instant access. So, what you're likely to spend over the next year or so, what you might have available for medium-term investments, so say 1 to 5 years, and what can be invested for the longer term, so for 5 years or more. As ever with planning, it's rarely black and white, and there are a number of sort of possible solutions that could be suitable for any situation. I also appreciate that, you don't have a crystal ball, you don't know exactly when you're going to need the cash. But what matters is that you consider the issues that are pertinent to your charity and come up with a financial plan that looks reasonable in the circumstances. In essence, we'd say, the longer the time horizon, the more you can withstand the volatility of equities and stock markets. You can, ride out that volatility. In general, we'd say that your time horizon should be at least 5 years if you're considering investing in equity markets. But there are other solutions suitable for shorter term time horizons. And with any traditional sort of medium risk investment portfolio, there should be a balance of investments within it. So there might be some allocation to lower risk, highly liquid investments that can meet shorter term cash flow requirements, and some higher risk, higher returning investments for that sort of longer term portion. Another thing to consider that goes hand in hand with investment objectives is whether capital growth, income, or a combination of the two is the focus. If you are drawing down on your investments, think about whether you can take a total return approach to withdrawals. So that's where your withdrawals come sort of primarily from income, but can be augmented with capital if required. Particularly if you are taking a total return approach to withdrawals, it's important to make sure that you decide on a sustainable rate of drawdown and balance both your current and future beneficiaries. So, only spend what is affordable on an ongoing basis. That's very much dictated by your long-term strategy. And your investment manager should be able to guide you on what level of drawdown is sustainable in the long run. This is particularly important, I think, for endowed charities or those wanting to exist into perpetuity, as you have a responsibility to maintain the purchasing power of your portfolio. Clearly spending too much now can reduce your future capacity to spend. And although a crisis now is important, sadly, there will probably likely be crises in the future too. An important thing to get right is the level of risk you are able and willing to take. And it broadly breaks down into two considerations. So the first is capacity for loss. This comes back to your objectives and time horizon. How able are you to take risk and to withstand temporary or even permanent losses in the value of your portfolio? For example, if your portfolio fell 20% in value, would the entity be able to continue functioning as normal? This comes back to why you shouldn't invest too heavily in equities if you have a short-term time horizon. Your appetite for risk is more subjective and is inevitably difficult with a group of trustees versus making that decision as an individual. Collectively, you should try and ascertain how willing you are to tolerate fluctuations in the value of your portfolio. Would a 10% fall keep most of the trustees up at night? And although this sort of sounds hard, it's important to try and remove your own personal feelings here and think about risk in the context of the charity and this portfolio. These are things that you should be able to finesse with your investment manager, but it's good to get an idea amongst yourselves before you enter into those conversations. Most investment houses will also have risk questionnaires that you can complete to help you in these discussions. Another thing that you may want to consider is an ethical policy. This is something that understandably we talk to our clients a lot about and that probably generates the most debate amongst trustees. So you might consider positive screening. So that's when you define the sort of companies you do want to invest in. Or perhaps you want your investment manager to focus on those companies with strong ESG characteristics, so environmental, social, and governance characteristics. You might want to do negative screening, which involves applying restrictions against certain companies or sectors, say, no tobacco or armaments. You might also want an investment manager who engages with the companies they invest in to help drive positive change. So there are a lot of things to be considered there, but you need to decide what's right for your entity. When it comes to positive screening, we don't think that you do this at the you don't shouldn't affect investment returns. If anything, on the contrary, we think that companies that are well governed and have strong environmental and social policies are likely to be better long-term investments. Studies have shown that poorly governed companies underperform the wider market by around 3 to 4% per annum. Similarly, those companies with a diverse board and strong female leadership have generated a return on equity almost 3% higher than those companies who do not. So not only does sort of strong ESG practices sound like a good selling point, it's also beneficial from an investment perspective. But be aware of greenwashing. It's easy for companies to talk a big game about the good work that they're doing, but it's often the things that they don't mention that are what matters. We do a lot of in-depth analysis to delve into all the practices of the companies we invest in. Another thing worth noting is that good corporate governance is not the same as ethics. There are a number of companies that our charities might typically avoid from an ESG point of view, such as Diageo, the alcohol maker. But due to the work they do with their local farming communities and their environmental practices, they actually sort of score quite well on sort of ESG ratings metrics. So bear that in mind as well. Exclusions and restrictions, it's worth thinking about whether you want to implement any of those. Again, it's important to remember that, although trustees will all have their own personal views and preferences, anything implemented here must be appropriate to your charity. The Bishop of Oxford case in the 1990s presided over this exact point. The case assessed whether the church could justifiably prohibit investments in tobacco companies in its products. The outcome of that case is a good guideline for trustees. It's also important to remember the text in the blue box. that in most cases, the primary duty when investing charitable funds is to seek the best financial return to allow you to pursue the organization's objectives. Therefore, when implementing any restrictions which could conflict with that primary objective, it needs to be justified in one of three ways. So either if an investment directly conflicts with the aims of the charity, so an NHS charity investing in tobacco products, or if you think you could lose donors or cause reputational damage as a result of having certain investments. And finally, if you have concluded that excluding a certain area would result in very little financial detriment. But again, your investment manager should be able to help guide you in these conversations. So now that we have worked out in broad terms what the charity's investment objectives are, we're now in a position to write that down in a format that makes sense and that covers the key points so that both those within the charity as well as the investment managers have a shared understanding of the charity's financial situation. I guess the first thing to say is that although your investment manager can help you and sort of guide you in producing this, the investment policy statement should be very much owned by the trustees. It's your document at the end of the day, and not the investment manager. So you need to take ownership of it, but they can help and guide you. Investment policy statements don't need to be long or complex, but it should contain the key points which are relevant to your charity's situation. So we've then got a number of the different things that you might want to include in the investment policy statement. And we've got a fuller document which we will circulate after the session. But just to go through some of those headings. So you might want to start off with an introduction. This might include information about the total value of your assets, the amount available for investment, and the role that investments are going to play within your charity. You should then talk about your investment objectives and time horizon. Is there a total return which you are looking to achieve over time? Are there any ongoing withdrawal requirements when it comes to withdrawals? Are these coming from income or a total return approach? You should then talk about your attitude to risk and capacity for loss, which we've already covered. Another issue to explore is whether any spending from the portfolio is within the discretion of the charity or if it's an absolute commitment. Eligible asset classes. So here you'd probably note which asset classes you're prepared to invest in. So that might include a number of the asset classes that we covered earlier. You might also want to include any sort of minimum or maximum asset allocation ranges for each asset class, which you've agreed with your investment manager. So perhaps you're comfortable investing sort of 50% in equities, but the range is between 30 and 80%. You also might want to include some investment restrictions. Perhaps there are certain asset classes you don't want to invest in, but just be aware that the more you limit your available investment universe, the harder it might be for your investment manager to generate investment performance. Then you come on to ethical policy. So as you said, any sort of negative or positive screening. Benchmarks is something that we haven't covered. So it's good to select a comparator or comparators that will help you decide if the investment manager is performing well. There are a number of different benchmarks that you could include, and most of our clients use one or a combination of these. So the first is a cash or inflation linked benchmark. So this might be sort of inflation plus 3% per annum. And this type of comparator should be a good reflection of what the charity's long-term investment objectives are. It's not going to be a great comparator in short time periods because it doesn't take into account the sort of market or economic backdrop, but it's good to see whether your portfolio is achieving your long-term objectives. The next is a sort of composite market index. So this is where you take the sort of strategic or expected long-term asset allocation of the portfolio and assign an appropriate market index to each asset class. So the FTSE All-Share for UK equities, for example. And then you weight them according to their sort of strategic asset allocation positions. You then add these numbers up to give a composite market index against which the performance of the whole portfolio can be measured. And finally, there are a number of peer group comparators. We tend to use ARC quite a lot. They have some charity specific composites, which sort of pulls together the returns of actual charity portfolios managed by investment houses from across the UK and splits them into different risk bands. So you can find an index that compares the performance of other charity portfolios managed to a similar level of risk to yours. Whatever benchmark you use, you need to make sure that it is a good match for the strategy you're taking. And then finally, sort of management, reporting, monitoring. In this section include how the investments are going to be managed. For example, on a discretionary basis, this is when trustees delegate the day-to-day management of the investments to an investment manager within that agreed mandate. And this is very much the norm these days. This section should also summarize what information the investment manager should provide you and how regularly, how often you'll meet. Perhaps you'll have annual meetings. It's also worth including a list of the authorized signatories and on what basis they can provide instructions to the investment manager. Finally, it should also state when the investment policy was approved and when it will next be reviewed. It's good practice to review it reasonably regularly. You might want to do a sort of light touch review every year or so, perhaps with a more fuller review every sort of 3 or 5 years, or if there's been a material change in your circumstances. Right, so now you've agreed on your investment objectives and written your investment policy statement. You can now think about working with an investment manager. Selecting an investment manager is another topic which deserves a whole section that sadly we don't have time for. And we've got a booklet that goes into it in more detail. So if that is of interest, let Penny know and we can send it. But I'll touch on a couple of the key points. So I think if you haven't worked with an investment manager before, the industry can seem quite opaque. While you might have come across, a number of big high street banks, investment houses may be less so. So Google can be a useful starting point to do some due diligence. Be wary, though, that the first results that might come up might not be the most appropriate to you. They might have paid to be there. We would recommend looking in sector publications like the Charity Times and Charity Finance magazines. They give a pretty comprehensive overview of the sector. Perhaps the most useful way, though, is to ask for recommendations. If you have other contacts within the charity sector that have been through a similar exercise of late, then ask them for their advice or if there's anyone they recommend. Once you've got your long list of managers, you can then approach them asking for a proposal for your investments and ask them to tell you a little bit of information about them. You can then think about conducting a beauty parade where you sort of interview those investment managers. When comparing investment managers, you'll inevitably look at past performance, but be aware, every firm will try and show themselves in the best possible light. You should also remember that past performance is no guide to future performance. There are a few things to consider which you've highlighted on this page. So the first is objectives. Make sure when comparing performance, you're comparing like with like. There's no good seeing performance from one manager who's targeting inflation plus 4% versus another manager who's looking for cash-like returns. They clearly have very different objectives and will be taking very different levels of risk in order to achieve it. The second is time periods. You need to make sure the time periods are the same. Even just 1 month out can make a big difference. So think about looking at it over perhaps discrete calendar year performance, or say 1, 3, 5, even 10 years to a sort of set end date. The next is sample sets. By that I mean, on what basis are these figures derived? Are they real clients being managed by that team, or is it a model or simulated performance? Similarly, is it a composite of clients, or have they, they just selected their 2 best performing funds? Either way, good to have a good understanding there. And finally, fees. Again, good that you are comparing like with like. Is performance net or gross of fees? And are they including all costs and charges within that? We think it's important that fees are set out in a clear and transparent way. Fundamentally, it's important that you select an investment manager who you think you can trust and who you can see yourself working with over the long term. They should provide you with regular reports. Maybe they have an online portfolio. Is the manager accessible and available to attend meetings? Ultimately, the relationship and service levels should suit you and your requirements. Finally, communication is really important in order to help manage risk and ensure the portfolio remains suitable for you. It also, regular communication and meetings gives you the opportunity to review your investment manager and the portfolio they're managing. My final slide before we go into the breakout sessions is, once you've spent all this time and consideration thinking about your investment objectives, time horizon, and coming up with a suitable strategy, try and stick to it. Unless, of course, your requirements have changed, in which case it might be appropriate to review the strategy. But if your objectives remain the same, it's likely that the agreed strategy is appropriate. So don't try and be too clever and chop and change based on market conditions. Your investment manager will be doing that for you. This slide shows the emotional roller coaster that can accompany the peaks and troughs of equity markets. Its purpose is to demonstrate some of the emotions and actions we're trying to avoid. So if we start on the left-hand side, this is when equity markets are buoyant, stock prices are rising, everyone's feeling optimistic, and the longer it goes on for, the higher markets go and the more excited they become. But it's when markets have performed their best that financial risk is at its greatest. There's a temptation to sort of invest more here and take on risk. But as we know, investments fluctuate and go up and down, and the longer and higher markets have gone, the greater risk there is of a correction. So don't try and take on more risk at that point. Once markets start to weaken, concern sets in, followed by fear and panic. It's at this point that we encourage investors to hold their nerve and stay invested, despite any desire to get out of equities, because it's at that point that financial opportunity is at its greatest, because after time, markets will recover and the cycle begins again. So if you sell out at this point, you run the risk of missing out on the recovery. But, I think this really emphasizes the importance of making sure you've got the initial strategy, time horizon, and risk level correct. What we want to avoid is you needing to withdraw money at that low point in markets. So that is all it from the sort of presentation point. Are there any questions before we move on to the breakout sessions?
I've certainly got a question, Libby. In fact, I've got 2, but that might be greedy. So if other people have questions, do put your Zoom hand up or your actual hand, or put something in the chat. But in the meantime, perhaps I could ask my first question, which is...
Yeah, I'll stop sharing.
Is there a threshold, a financial threshold, at which it's useful to have an investment manager?
No, so there are sort of investment options available for all size of portfolio. Is that your question about the sort of size of portfolio? Yeah, so as I said in the first page, there are a number of sort of charity specific funds where you pool together with other investors, and those tend to have minimum investments of, say, I don't know, sort of 10 or 20,000. But clearly there are charities that have much bigger pots, and there are other solutions available there. So no minimum, but it's just about making sure you find the solution that is right given the size of your investment portfolio.
Great, thank you. We've had a question from Atul. Do you have a view on pooled or segregated, which I guess is a follow-on from what you were just saying?
Yeah, sure. I mean, it very much depends on your requirements. A lot of charities might have similar requirements. You know, if you want a sort of standard medium risk portfolio and you don't have any particular niche ethical requirements, then there might be a pooled solution that fits well with your objectives. But the benefit of, and specifically for sort of lower or sort of smaller portfolios, those pooled investment options can be a more cost-effective option, but they aren't designed to meet your specific requirements. So that's the benefit of a segregated or bespoke portfolio, is that they are specifically designed to meet your requirements, and they can also be adapted. So, if you know that you have a particular cash requirement or liability, then they can be set up to meet that. Or if your requirements change in the future, then they can be adjusted to reflect that. But yeah, again, it's just making sure the option is right for you, or that if you do go into a pooled fund, that it's a good match for your objectives.
Great, thank you, Libby. That was very clear. I'm going to turn off the recording now. So thank you to those of you who watched on record, and thank you very much to Libby. It was completely fascinating.